And let me also remind everyone that this session here is being recorded and then it will be uploaded on YouTube. So, okay, welcome to all of you for this new cycle of linguistic seminars of the Center for Theoretical Linguistics. This new academic year, we are going to prepare both online seminars like this one and presential seminars, depending on the speaker's location and preference. The first speaker of this new cycle is ONKAR SINGH. And ONKAR holds a master's degree in theoretical and applied linguistics from the University of Cambridge. And he's now doing a PhD in Italian at the same university under the supervision of Adam Ledgway. His master's degree's thesis focused on the emergence of differential object marking in spoken Northern Italian, which is also going to be the topic of today's talk. However, his research interests also cover linguistic phenomena from Old Romance and particularly the Italo-Romance domain, such as the phenomenon of verb second in Old Venetian, which led to the recent publication of an article in Isogloss. So, okay, let me give the floor to ONKAR for his talk on A me mi convince, an investigation on the emergence of differential object marking in spoken Northern Italian. ONKAR, you may share the screen when you want.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. And muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí e por tenerme. I'm going to share my presentation now, so hopefully that works. All right. Can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
Oh, no, what am I doing? Sorry, wrong one. There we go. Can you see the first slide? Oh, yes. What should be the first slide?
We see that perfect.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for being here today. So as Alessandro said, today's presentation is going to be on an emergent system of differential object marking that's emerged, let's say within the last kind of 50 years in spoken Northern Italian. So the terminology that I'm going to be using today, as some of you might know, was coined by Bossung in 1991. In kind of more prescriptive grammars, we might know this phenomenon as the prepositional accusative. It's a bit of a problematic term for me, and I won't be using it. I'll be using dom henceforth, just because it brings in a debate of whether the objects in these constructions are prepositional phrases or DPs or KPs, and it's a bit of a kind of wormhole that thankfully I won't be going into in this talk. So as we know, dom is quite widespread in Romance, both in diachrony and in modern varieties. You get the kind of textbook example from Standard Spanish. So let me see if I can use my laser pointer. Perfect. So you get the textbook example from Standard Spanish in 1A and 1B. So you get, for example, he visto el coche, pero he visto la chica, where obviously that dom marker there is obligatory. I've put a little one next to Standard Spanish just because I kind of hate the term standard with any language. And obviously, with respect to Spanish, a fair lot of work has been done on other varieties of Spanish, such as Mexican Spanish or Argentinian Spanish, where it's been argued that specificity trumps animacy, and hence we get inanimate objects marked with dom. But just for this kind of introduction, let's say you get that minimal pair of an inanimate object not being marked with dom, but obviously inanimate object being marked with dom. And obviously, off the back of that, a lot of the prescriptivist literature says that we get dom whenever we get an animate object, essentially, so animate or human. But an increasing amount of more recent literature marks a more fine-grained kind of distinction with regards to these parameters. And what actually we can define dom as being is the marking of a subset of accusative objects in transitive sentences based on language-specific, semantico-pragmatic, and structural parameters. So when we talk about structural parameters here, we can be referring to nominal parameters, verbal parameters, or clausal parameters. I'm going to give a few examples in a second of these parameters in kind of isolation, but something worth bearing in mind, especially with regard to this talk, is that we don't ever get these parameters on their own, essentially. These are parameters that have to work in specific unison, let's say, within a given variety for the licensing of dom, and across Romance, what those specific clusters might be, both in diachrony and synchrony, is subject to parametric variation, essentially. Just some examples here in isolation, like I was saying, from Romance. You might get clausal parameters in the licensing of DOM, the kind of plus minus licensing of DOM. So with some varieties whereby when that object is in CP, so it's CP dislocated, DOM is obligatory. However, when DOM occurs post-verbally, which we can assume is in little VP, it's optional, essentially. So you get the minimal pair between 2A and B. So a los profesores ya les había visto, and then ya había visto los profesores, ya había visto a los profesores, essentially. Another example could be that of restrictions on DP type, which is actually something that's quite privy to the presentation today with regard to spoken Northern Italian. So you get the example of Sardinian. Sardinian here, I should kind of disambiguate, is a bit of a problematic umbrella term for what should be understood as a continuum of various dialects, essentially. But for the intent of this slide and this specific example, we'll just call it Sardinian, where in this variety, you get a D head versus DP split, essentially. So whenever we get pronominal DP elements that are animate, you get DOM. So you get, for example, I have seen him, I have seen John. So you get with the proper, the personal pronoun and the proper noun. However, whenever we try DOM with anything animate and phrasal, it's marginal, and for a lot of speakers, completely out. So you get that example in 3C. Again from Sardinian of I've seen the doctor with that common noun, where for a lot of speakers that's out, essentially. Whilst I don't look at common nouns and this kind of split between D head and DP within my particular presentation too much, it's something worth bearing in mind, essentially, that this is a bit of a at least across Romance kind of situation going on, where DOM is initially licensed with head elements, so personal pronouns, kinship terms that aren't phrasal, proper nouns, and then DOM proves a bit more difficult in terms of licensing in some varieties when we cross that threshold into phrasal objects. And then finally, we've got some verbal parameters here, so a bit of a spoiler in terms of the data from this talk, whereby with certain verbs, DOM might be licensed, but certain verbs is a little bit more marginal. So you have 4A, a me mi hanno visto in città, so they saw me in town, a bit of a British English translation there for you. So with vedere, to see, DOM is licensed completely fine, but proves a bit more marginal for some speakers when you have a verb like picchiare in 4B. So a Marco l'hanno picchiato, for some speakers that's marginal, hence the question mark there. And then we've got some semantico-pragmatic parameters, such as specificity, animacy, or definiteness. I've used the example of Romanian here, of the textbook example of whereby specific objects license DOM, when they're non-specific, they don't. So you get in 5A, for example, îl caut pe secretarul managerul lui. So I'm looking for the manager secretary, that's someone specific, someone that we both know that we're talking about, someone animate, obviously, hence DOM. But DOM proves DOM's out of the question in 5B, essentially. Îl caut pe un secretar care să vorbească engleză. So I'm looking for a secretary that can speak English. We don't know who the secretary is. I maybe put out an announcement for it. I've used the example of Romanian here as a better one than Spanish, for example, whereby in Spanish we know that the DOM marking there is optional, and for a lot of speakers I'd say it's becoming a lot more accepted. So something like, for example, busco a un secretario que hable inglés, I think is becoming a bit more acceptable for speakers of Spanish. So we've had a bit of an overview there in terms of what these parameters might look like, structural or semantico-pragmatic. And that'd be really kind of interest to this presentation, essentially, just to see that when we do get those clusters, how they behave, because up until now, I guess in this introduction, we've seen them in isolation, essentially. A bit of an introduction and background to the situation within Italy and the Italian peninsula, for those who might not be aware. So what we can argue is that we actually get a bit of a situation of triglossia in the Italian peninsula between Standard Italian, the Italo-Romance varieties, the dialects or dialetti. Obviously, with dialect there being a bit of a false friend from English dialect, we mean the uncontrolled developments of Latin within the Italian peninsula, and then what can be argued to be the kind of birth child between the two, which is regional Italian, essentially. We know that there's a lot of variation within the Italian peninsula, kind of diamesic, diastratic, ditopic variation. So it's with specific interest to DOM, let's say, that's kind of what led me to looking at DOM in spoken Northern Italian in the first place, because we've got quite a rich playing field here in terms of research. So the areas that my particular research for today corresponds to is the areas in kind of pink and purple and yellow here on the map. Anything south of that, south of the La Spezia Rimini isogloss isn't considered here, essentially. So we're looking at everything kind of above the brown and orange areas on the map. You've got another kind of representation here of what I was talking about. So essentially we've got dialects of the sister varieties to Italian, regional Italian and standard Italian. And for this particular presentation and this talk, we're going to be looking at the regional Italian, obviously, but the kind of right-hand side of this diagram, essentially. Standard Italian here is obviously to be understood as the prescriptive taught variety of Italian that I think it's safe to say that most people aren't fluent in. It's a kind of acquired tongue, just like the standard varieties of any language, I'd say. So when we talk about DOM across Romance, Italian often isn't given as prototypical example of it. You know, you get the prototypical examples of Spanish, of Catalan more recently, of Romanian, of Southern Italian dialects and Southern regional Italian. But within standard Italian, DOM its distribution is a lot more limited, essentially. So it's limited to CP topicalized personal pronouns with so-called type 2 psych verbs. So verbs with an experiencer object and a theme subject. So verbs such as preoccupare, to worry, convincere, convince, spaventare, scare. So you've got the example in 6 there where DOM is obligatory there. So a me preoccupa, it worries me, essentially. But within the last 50 years, there's been an increasing number of literature and work that's emerged that's highlighted the presence of DOM within Northern spoken Italian, which is obviously the subject of our talk today. I'm going to be referring to it as SNI, just moving forward, just because it's a bit easier, rolls off the tongue a bit better. But essentially, starting with Beninca in the late 80s, you get literature that has proposed essentially that there is an incipient system of DOM within this variety of regional Italian in SNI. Interesting in terms of kind of diachronically placing this is that there's no mention of this in Rolf's study of regional Italian from the post-war period. That's led a lot of people to believe that maybe we're dealing with a phenomenon that has emerged in the post Second World War period. It becomes a bit more difficult to trace diachronically because there are a lot of resources out there from the kind of pre-war period, the kind of period during the war, both wars essentially, such as kind of letters from the trenches, etc., where we do get DOM, but it's never really clear there whether we're dealing with something that is purely a regional Italian phenomenon from the north, or whether we're dealing with, for example, speakers that might have been a bit more proficient in dialect and carrying across essentially what is a dialectal feature. Something I should have explained, actually, if we go back to our map there, is that DOM in the Northern Italian dialects, so those Italo-Romance dialects that are represented in purple and yellow here, are a lot more sporadic north of this isogloss, essentially. So they're a lot more sporadic in the area that we're looking at. And obviously south of that, it's a lot more frequent, and obviously is that kind of prototypical example. So kind of when it comes to dating this, it's a bit difficult because we don't know whether we're dealing with an influence from a dialect, essentially. But what is of interest, I guess, to us in terms of this is the fact that it's a lot more sporadic in that area, meaning that we're dealing with a phenomenon that pops up in regional Italian that's very limited in standard Italian and a lot more sporadic in the dialect, hence bringing up the question as to how we're getting this phenomenon in Northern regional Italian. So in terms of what the literature's proposed, we're told that DOM in SNI is limited to 3 verb types in terms of verbal parameters. So we're told that it's limited to type 2 psych verbs, like the ones that we've seen, and we'll go into a bit more detail regarding in a sec. Causative structures with fare, do, and lasciare, let, and a group of what I'm going to call uncategorized transitive verbs, such as vedere, as you see, or interrogare, sorry, as you see in C. So, for example, you get the psych verb in 7a, a me questa situazione mi preoccupa, so this situation worries me. You get the causative in 7b, a te ti hanno fatto entrare, with fare entrare, to literally let in. And then C with this kind of uncategorized group, which I'll be calling non-psych verbs moving forward. A noi ci hanno interrogato al commissariato, so they interrogated us at the police station. In terms of DP parameters, in terms of what the literature has proposed, that kind of literature from the late 80s as to what we get in SNI, is that we're told that it's obligatory with first and second personal pronouns, and it's optional or marginal with the third person, essentially. So with personal pronouns and lexical DPs. So that's following Beninca in 1988. So 8A and B are marginal / out for a lot of speakers, and that's something we'll be looking at, essentially. So a lui l'abbiamo convinto che è una buona idea. We convinced him that it's a good idea, or a Marco l'abbiamo visto in città, which is question mark for a lot of people, essentially. That when compared with 7A to C, we see that kind of split then between first and second versus third, essentially. And then in terms of clausal parameters, we're told that it must be a CP dislocated topic, so that object, and that contrastive focus isn't allowed or isn't licensed with DOM. So that's according to Beretta 1989. So we can get, for example, a me quella scena mi ha colpito, with that a me being a CP dislocated topic. But the second we try to make anything contrastive or not CP, it's not allowed. So 9B is out for northern speakers. So quella scena mi ha colpito a me, which is perceived as having a southern flavor, essentially, so being more typical of regional Italian south of the isogloss that we looked at. And then according to Beretta, we can't get contrastive focus either, so 9C. So a me quella scena mi ha colpito, ma non agli altri. So that scene really got to me, but not the others. So bear that in mind, actually, because 9C is something that we're going to be testing in this investigation, just to see how that works and if that's still the case, essentially, in the modern day. Looking at our type 2 psych verbs, I guess it's of interest here for us to disambiguate these and explore these a little bit, because they're going to become the focal element, let's say, of our proposal on our data. So basically, like I said, it's verbs with experience objects and theme subjects. According to Belletti and Rizzi's seminal work from 1988, they propose that these experience objects aren't deep objects, in the sense that they're not first merged in the complement position of VP, but rather in the subject position, so spec VP in this case. And what that leads to is an internal conflict, essentially, between the syntax that would necessitate that otherwise to be in the object position, and the semantics here of what they argue to be inherent accusative case assignment. So they say that actually, let's have a look at the syntax tree here. They say that actually the object is first merged in spec VP, where it receives inherent accusative case from the predicate, essentially, and that leads to a conflict, essentially, in the internal structure of these psych verbs. So what they argue is that the verb skips the theme, and like I said, assigns that case to the experiencer, which is the argument here, the object. And they propose something called Principle 119. So given a theta grid where we have an experiencer and a theme, so essentially that object, which will later acquire DOM, being higher than the theme, the experience is projected to a higher position, essentially. And they argue that DOM is the kind of resolution of this, essentially. So it's kind of an optimal arrangement, essentially, that when we can get a kind of satisfaction of this principle, we get that with having that DOM object in CP, for example, where it can raise higher than the subject, essentially. That subject, obviously, they argue to raise to spec TP, as we'd expect. So our research questions, essentially based off of that introduction and the introduction to what's been proposed in the literature, are the following, essentially. In the most general sense, what we want to do, or what I wanted to do, was look at the parameters tested in the early literature from the late 80s in SNI and see to what point they've been extended and what point we can disambiguate them. We say that the third person is marginal or is out. Let's test that. To what point is it out? Are we talking about a D head versus DP split? And plus, how do these parameters work in unison, essentially? So breaking down the third person, looking at which lexical DPs are more or less accepted with DOM for speakers of SNI, verb types as well. So essentially, if we've seen that it's been proposed that DOM occurs wherever we get that internal conflict between the syntax and the semantics, we get this, let's say, subject in disguise. We get this higher argument that isn't a subject, it's actually an object. Let's test that with other verb types, essentially, where we get subjects in disguise. So things like small verbs, small clauses, for example. So, for example, a te ti considero intelligente, I consider you clever. And verbs of perception, a te ti ho sentito entrare, I heard you enter, essentially. So ones where we get this kind of, you get an object that is also a subject, essentially. to see whether it is the case, whether we're talking about something structural here, whether we can expect DOM every time we get this internal conflict. And our other kind of research questions will be to test the extent of animacy restrictions, essentially. Do we get it with plus animate minus human, so animals? And like I said, that question of parameter clusters, when and where must these structural or the semantico-pragmatic parameters work in unison for DOM to be licensed? Let's test them and see which ones we can expect essentially to work in unison and where things might be out for certain speakers. And like I said, going beyond the initial literature on DOM and SNI to see where it's been extended, essentially, where things were proposed not to be the case in that literature from the late 80s, has that changed since, essentially. So in terms of the study in the data group, it was a group of native speakers of SNI from various regions of northern Italy. It was a mixed gender group, aged between 80 and 40 years of age, all of whom had lived in Italy since birth. So we're talking about native speakers of this variety. And they were given a questionnaire comprising of 75 utterances that tested these parameters, essentially. So tested verbal, clausal, and nominal parameters. They were given 3 options to kind of test to kind of add a nuance, essentially, to their grammaticality judgment. So not just having a yes or no, black or white situation, seeing where there are cases of doubt for these speakers. They were given 3 options of acceptable, unacceptable, I have doubts, with a little preamble essentially telling them that we were asking for their grammaticality judgment, on regional Italian and not their kind of, essentially for alarm bells not to be rung in terms of their knowledge of the standard language. There was a beta study as well, in which I found that the presence or absence of clitic doubling had little effect on acceptability, and common nouns were out for all speakers, so they weren't included in this study. In the study that was sent out, so we see that here. So post-verbal DOM was also tested, and for a lot of speakers was said to have a southern flavour. So we're talking about DOM in little VP. There's no semantic difference between plus or minus clitic doubling for them, and common nouns are out. So you know, our doctors, our postmen, ho visto al postino l'ho visto. So I saw the postman out for a lot of speakers. So this wasn't included in this version of the study. In terms of the verbal parameters, we've got our 3 expected verbs tested straight from the literature. So our type 2 psych verbs, our causatives with fare and lasciare, and what we're going to be called non-psych verbs. So our kind of unclassifiable transitive, so vedere, see, and chiamare. And then the 2 that I said I was going to test to see whether it is something structural. So verbs of perception, so veder fare, sentir fare, and small clauses, so considerare, ritenere. In terms of clausal parameters, the CB topicalized DPs as expected from the literature, and also we're going to test contrastive focus as well to see whether Beretta's initial findings still hold in the present day. And then, like I said, in terms of nominal parameters, we're testing our personal pronouns and our lexical DPs, so kinship terms, proper nouns, and then sorry, that should just be plus animate minus human there. So in terms of, if we get to the actual data now, we see that, as expected from that early literature, psych verbs and causatives were found to be the most accepted by these speakers, and we can assume the most felicitously licensed. The least felicitously licensed group was that of non-psych verbs. So to some extent, we can say that whilst small clauses and verbs of perception were below that 50% mark, so a lot more marginal than psych verbs and causatives, they were more accepted by the speakers than the non-psych verbs. So to some extent, we can maybe propose that our expectation that DOM should be found wherever we have that internal conflict, wherever we get subjects in disguise, to some extent holds here. So we see that here, for example. Non-psych verbs are obviously those verbs without that theta versus syntax conflict, and they're the ones with the least licensed DOM. And then obviously we have that marginality and acceptance for verbs of perception and small clauses. When we look at grammatical person, as expected, we get that split between first and second person versus third, essentially, where it's wholly more accepted DOM in the first and second person versus the third person. When we break that down versus to kind of really make sure that we're coming to the right conclusion in terms of verb types and kind of clustering those parameters, like I said, we see that kind of that holds across all verb types, that it is mainly accepted, obviously with a preference for psych and causatives there in the first and second person, essentially. So we can say that at least when it comes to the first and second person with those personal pronouns, Dom is felicitously licensed again across all verb types. And there's possibly a preference there then for this arrangement, for having the first and second person, essentially. And this is an idea that we'll come to later on, that this is possibly adhering to the original parameters under which Dom was first licensed, which I propose later on, spoiler, to be the psych verbs with the first and second person. So like I said, we can expect a split then, essentially. So that expectation is borne out that we have a 1 and 2 versus 3 split. But what I wanted to test here essentially is how did this play out when we break down that third person into subparameters. So plus or minus human, lexical versus pronominal, and then different DP types, essentially. Let's break down that third person and see where it's more and less accepted. So just as a kind of taking a macro view, there's not much difference essentially between pronominal and lexical types. They're both more or less not favored, not felicitously licensed with Dom, and there's not any kind of significant preference, as we can see, between the two types. Perhaps a preference for pronominal types versus lexical DPs, but again, not the most felicitously licensed. This holds again over verb types, essentially. So with that third person, we see that's not very accepted, across DP types, essentially. So we see that, again, there's not much of a difference, not much of a split, let's say, in the third person between pronominal forms and the 3 DP types that are under investigation here. So proper nouns, kinship terms, and that plus animate minus human, so animals. But what's interesting here, and here's where we get a lot of, let's say, the juicy data, is when these parameters interact with each other. In isolation, we don't get much of a story to tell with the third person. As expected, it's very much out for a lot of speakers. But when we combine them, let's say, with verb types and DP types, we see a bit of a different story. When it comes to pronominal forms, so here I split between the third person singular and the first person plural. This was, as we can see, it's wholly accepted, very much accepted with causatives versus other verb types. This is a bit of a blip in the data in terms of what we'll see as an ongoing trend with psych verbs, essentially. But here, for some reason, we've seen with causatives, it's accepted around the kind of 75% mark for these speakers. But with other verb types, it's completely out. So we get 11A, for example, with that causative verb. So a lui lo hanno lasciato venire, so they let him come, which was accepted. But when we compare that to the other verb types, it's out for these speakers. So a lui l'abbiamo convinto, che è una buona idea. We convinced him it's a good idea, with that psych verb out. A lui lo hanno aspettato, ma non si è fatto vivo. So they waited for him, but he never showed up. Out with that non-psych verb there, aspettare, to wait. And then with D and E as well, so with that small clause and the verb of perception out. A lui non lo considero bello, I don't think he's good looking, and a lui la nonna l'aveva già visto assaggiare la lasagna. So she had already seen him try the lasagna out for these speakers. When we look at the third person plural, we see that psych verbs are the only verb type that felicitously licensed Dom with that third person plural form. For some reason, like I said, the third person, I don't know whether there was an issue with the data collection, but the third person singular seems to be an outlier in our data pattern. But what we'll see here with the third person plural and that kind of preference there for psych verbs is a bit of an ongoing pattern whereby more marginal parameters, or what kind of, if we take a bit of a macro view, what have been argued to be more marginal parameters are more felicitously licensed, provided it's with a type 2 psych verb, essentially. So when we see that third person plural pronominal form, again, more accepted with psych verbs. So we get 12A, allora il suo comportamento li stupiva tanto. So his behavior really shocked them, but out with the other verb types. So allora li ho fatti studiare. So, the glosses are a bit out there. So I made them study with the far studiare causative out. And then 12C to E. Allora li ho abbracciati, so I hugged them out. Allora non li consideravano capaci di averlo fatto, so they weren't considered capable of having done it, with that small clause there out. And then allora li abbiamo sentiti cantare, so we heard them singing or sing. sorry, that translation's wrong as well. So we heard them sing, which was out for these speakers. Once again, we see that higher preference for psych verbs with proper nouns now, so testing other DP types and moving away from the pronominal types. We see a higher acceptance with it with psych verbs in comparison to the other verbs looked at. So with psych verbs, we see that it's mainly accepted by a lot of speakers, and with the other verb types, it's mainly unaccepted, although there's some margin for doubt essentially with the non-psych verbs, small clauses, and verbs of perception there. And that raises a question as to the licensing of DOM with these verb types. We've seen up until now they're mainly kind of marginal and not accepted, but perhaps there is that doubt there of you know, these for these speakers there being this internal conflict, but not enough so for some reason for DOM to be licensed with them. So with the proper noun there, 13a, a Gianni quella scena l'ho colpito tanto. So that scene really got to that situation. That scene really got to Gianni, but out with the other verb types that aren't psych verbs there. So ad Aldo l'ho fatto tornare. I made Aldo come back, was out. 13c, a Marco l'hanno picchiato, as we saw in what was my spoiler in the introduction. Marco was hit, or they hit Marco, was out. A Marco non ritengo divertente, I don't consider Marco fun, out. And then a Clara l'ho vista ballare ieri sera. So I saw Clara dance or dancing last night, was out with the small clause there and the verb perception. Once again, when we look at kinship terms, the results again are quite striking, with a very clear preference there for psych verbs and causatives, and completely out for the other verb types essentially. So 14a and b are in for these speakers. So alla mamma la sporcizia la innervosiva. So my mum is irritated, or was irritated in the sense by dirtiness, or it made my mum angry. And then 14b, a papà vedermi laureare l'ha fatto piangere. So seeing me graduate made my dad cry. So with that causative, so with that psych verb and the causative, that was in for these speakers, but then completely out when it came to the other verb type. So alla mamma l'ho aspettata in stazione, 100% out. Alla mamma la considero la persona più gentile che io conosca. So my mom's the kindest person that I know. And a papà l'ho sentito entrare ieri sera verso le 8. So I saw dad come in last night around 8 o'clock. Completely out for these speakers with no margin for doubt, essentially, which really hones in the fact that we're seeing a clear preference for psych verbs, and in this case, causatives. When we test the plus human minus animate here, something I should say that I didn't mention is that in that earlier data study as well, there was kind of, let's say, this kind of pseudo parameter that I tested of domesticated animal versus non-domesticated animal, where it was tested, for example, the dog versus the lion, the elephant, with the latter two being the domesticated parameters, which was out for all of these speakers. So it wasn't included in this particular presentation, but with the undomesticated, it was completely out. So when we look at, in this case, domesticated plus human minus plus animate minus human, again, a clear preference here for psych verbs. We can see that this parameter is most felicitously licensed with psych verbs, and it's out essentially for every other verb type. So you get 15a. Al cane I fuochi d'artificio lo spaventano molto. So fireworks scare my dog a lot, but out for every other verb type. Al cane l'ho fatto entrare. I let the dog in. With the causative. 15c. Al cane l'ho visto in giro. So I saw the dog about. Was out with the non-psych verb. Al cane non lo considero una minaccia. So I don't consider the dog to be a threat. And al cane l'ha già sentito entrare. So they, singular, have already heard the dog come in. So with every other verb type here, so we have non-psych verbs, small clauses, and our verbs of perception, this was out essentially. So again, we're seeing this kind of preference here for, let's say, these more marginal parameters to be most felicitously licensed when it's with psych verbs. So with those type 2 psych verbs that, as we'll see, are proposed to be the kind of original birthplace, for lack of a better term, or kind of starting ground for DOM in SNI. So contrastive focus due to time and content restraints within the initial study wasn't a fully tested parameter, but a few sentences were thrown in essentially just to get some initial judgments that would form the basis of a further study that's still in development regarding this, show that with, as we can expect, following our pattern, with psych verbs, contrastive focus in SNI was most felicitously licensed. So 16A there, a me questa situazione preoccupa, ma non a Maria. So this situation worries me, but it doesn't worry, or not Maria, so it doesn't worry Maria. With other verb types that were tested, for example, with causatives there, it was a bit more marginal. So 16B, a me il capo fa piangere, ma non agli altri. So my boss makes me cry, but he doesn't make the others cry. And this was most accepted amongst younger speakers. So again, when it comes to the age groups, I guess older speakers, so our eldest speakers were 40 years of age, and perhaps in hindsight, it would have been good, and maybe in future, in the future investigation to test kind of beyond this age bracket. But at least in terms of that age bracket that we tested, this was most accepted amongst the younger speakers and a lot less so by the older speakers, suggesting this is a new parameter in development. What's interesting here as well is that it goes against that literature from the 80s. So Beretta, who argued that contrastive focus isn't licensed in DOM. What's also interesting here as well is the fact that in Northern, so in SNI, in spoken Northern Italian, there is generally a preference for cleft sentences when we get contrastive focus in general. So it's interesting here that we get DOM with contrastive focus in a construction that isn't a cleft construction, and yet is nonetheless accepted by these younger speakers, possibly through analogy with sentences like 16A that are already part of their grammar within the standard and also within their regional Italian. So sentences like a me questa situazione preoccupa, we can assume maybe the contrastive focus there is an extension through analogy of sentences like that one. So let's come to some interim conclusions then. We see overall there's a higher acceptability of the first and second person pronouns with type 2 psych verbs and causatives. The first and second person pronouns are most felicitously licensed with DOM across all verb types. And DOM is accepted with all DP types, provided that they occur with a psych verb. So we saw that kind of, maybe it's a bad way of wording it there, but we saw that those more marginal DP types, so the proper nouns, the kinship terms, the third person pronominal forms, the animals, so the plus animate minus human, were most accepted, provided that they occurred with a psych verb. As we just saw there as well, DOM is accepted, although this parameter needs to be tested a lot better amongst younger speakers, and it's more marginal for older speakers. So that goes against the early literature on this. We can see that this is a parameter that's in development. It wasn't noted back then, but it has been noted now. That could be for various reasons. It could be the fact that, like I said, it is a parameter that's in development that wasn't accepted by speakers back then. If we assume those speakers to be the same ones who found it more marginal in the present day. Again, the source of data from that literature in the 80s wasn't the best as well, let's say. A lot of it was taken from textual corpora magazine articles where maybe there just wasn't a preference for contrastive focus, or maybe it wasn't the right context for one to find it in. But essentially, it'd be interesting to test that moving forward, essentially, in diachrony, when it is that we find this acceptance of contrastive focus. DOM was more marginal with small clauses, like we saw. So we saw that kind of less of a preference, or a less felicitous licensing of DOM in SNI with small clauses and those non-psych verbs. With the non-psych verbs, we can assume that's based off of the fact that they don't have an internal conflict, essentially, in their structure. But with small clauses, there is an internal conflict, but arguably they're a higher register verb. So essentially, there could be that kind of doubt between there being an internal conflict within these verbs, but also them pertaining to a higher register that within a spoken variety like spoken Northern Italian is mainly avoided. At least thinking of English, for example, small clauses are very much a high register thing that one avoids in spoken English. As we've seen, there's an optimal arrangement then of having the first and second person personal pronoun and a psych verb, which we know has already entered standard Italian. But when new parameters are introduced, we see that DOM is most felicitously licensed where one of these parameters is present, essentially. So if it's going to be a new verb type, then most felicitously licensed when we have that first or second personal pronoun that's being clustered with that, let's say, in this parameter. Or if we get different DP types, for example, that have been argued to be a bit more marginal, we see that this is most felicitously licensed and most accepted by these speakers when there's a psych verb. So that leads me onto my proposal here. So I propose that DOM in SNI first emerge with these CP topicalized first and second person personal pronouns with type 2 psych verbs. This is also to some extent justified or kind of, let's say, legitimized by the fact that this has already entered the standard. It's become so kind of grammaticalized at this point that we find this in standard Italian. Following Belecchi and Rizzi in their seminal work, I also argue that this is indeed inherent accusative case assignment, and that DOM in CP, in SNI, like we've seen, is the optimal arrangement for this, essentially, because it satisfies that principle 119. We get inherent accusative case assignment, which then, when that DOM object is CP topicalized, allows it to maintain that optimal arrangement of having experienced a theme, essentially having that experiencer before and preposing the subject. So as we can see, that's the optimal arrangement. Then there's this question about the third person, essentially. We've seen that there are certain arrangements and clusters in which it's most accepted. So with psych verbs, for example, we know that to be the optimal arrangement, but in a lot of cases, it's not eligible to be a DOM object with those verbs in which DOM is most accepted, and we know it to be, for example, like non-psych verbs. From the literature from the late 80s, we know that to have been the case. But for some reason, the third person there is not eligible for that, be it pronominally or lexically. And perhaps here there's a deictic parameter that we know exists in a lot of Italo-Romance varieties between proximal and distant, essentially. So maybe whereby the first and second person are understood within the discourse as being proximal, therefore being more easily, let's say, amenable to being candidates for topicalization, versus the third person, which might be understood as being distant, therefore not a candidate for being a topic, essentially. Like I said, this follows a lot of pattern within Italo-Romance varieties, where you get this kind of distinction between proximal and distant, and a lot of varieties in which you get 1, 2 versus 3 splits, either in kind of, in auxiliary verb assignment or in DOM. So this very much follows a pattern, essentially. Also, we've seen, and what I propose is that new parameters emerge through extension when they're first licensed with that optimal arrangement, which I've said, that kind of grammaticalized DOM with type 2 psych verbs and or the first and second person pronouns. We know that when new parameters are becoming more acceptable, it's normally the most accepted when we get one of these original parameters in that cluster. So either a type 2 psych verb or the first and second person pronouns as that DP. And as we've seen, we've got parameters that are in extension. So animals there, so those plus animate minus human, and contrastive focus, whereby we can see that amongst younger speakers, that's a lot more accepted, going against that earlier literature. Based on that proposal, essentially, we've got a couple of future research questions for what I have to admit was an incomplete study, complete for the basis for the goals and the objectives that it had. But it leads us to quite a few interesting and quite exciting future research questions. So there's that diachronic aspect there that I spoke about as well. So like I said, literature from the immediate post-war period from Rolfs, for example, doesn't highlight this being the case in what is quite a kind of extensive study on regional Italian and the way Italians spoke back then. So that brings in the question, where can we pinpoint that timing as having been? Are we talking about a phenomenon, for example, that emerges once we get immigration from southern Italy, where we know DOM has historically been a lot more prominent, to the north? Are we talking about an independent phenomenon that's emerged without contact, essentially? Like I said, the diachronic aspect becomes a bit difficult when we look at the sources that we do have from that immediate post-war period, because you never know at what point you're dealing with something that's a feature of a given dialect, be it rare, that has DOM within that space where spoken Northern Italian is spoken. And also, if we're to understand that spoken Italian really took off and kind of gained legs in the war, the time after the post-war period, to kind of, through kind of mass education, the spread of television, for example, mass media, it becomes a bit more difficult there. And that's a really interesting kind of future research question, is where can we pinpoint that? Do we have the resources to pinpoint that? Something I'd like to look at, or can be looked at in the future, is again that situation with common nouns here, and really kind of disambiguating that and seeing at what point we get you know, in what configurations they're more and less accepted. Like I said to you, like in that initial beta study, it was found to be unaccepted, but perhaps there are arrangements in which they're more accepted. And if they are, perhaps what we're seeing is a D head versus DP split with DOM in SNI. And then finally as well, for I guess a less easily resolved research question is that of that uncategorized third category of verbs. We know that in some arrangements, particularly with the first and second person personal pronoun, it's accepted. It's used on a daily basis. We can't discard that fact. We, you know, verbs like aspettare, vedere, chiamare, so wait, see, and call. These are licensed with DOM on a daily basis. And what's interesting as well is, at least within a kind of pan-Romance perspective in diachrony, wherever we find DOM with psych verbs, with causatives, which cross-linguistically is a bit of a pattern, at least within Romance as well, or cross-Romance, I'd say, we always get a set of verbs where DOM is less easily explained structurally. So again, this uncategorized verb type. So Ledgway 2009 in his grammar of Old Neapolitan finds this, that these are verbs from late Latin that were frequently licensed with the dative. So verbs like protect, pray, attack, defend. We're seeing a similar situation here, obviously without verbs like attack and defend essentially, but commonly used verbs like which we can assume to be commonly used with human objects, such as call, see, wait. So it'd be interesting to look at that, especially within the context of that diachronic situation of there always being this verb group that's less easily explained. That's all for today. So I just want to say really massive thanks to all of you, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. So are there any questions or comments for ONKAR? Yes, Maria Teresa.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk, ONKAR. I think it was really very good.
Thank you.
I would like to have some more information about one of the claims in your interim summary. If I understood this correctly, you claim that DOM with full DPs in combination with full DPs is better accepted by native speakers when the verb is a psychological verb, right? Why should this be the case? Do you have any suggestion about that?
I think it's a difficult one here, because I think that it's more accepted by these speakers because of this standard angle as well, in the sense that we know that psych verbs, at least not with lexical DPs there, is accepted in the standard. Perhaps there's this conflict in their heads between knowing that the verb type is accepted, but not being sure against the DP type. I think what I propose in my summary as well is the fact that DOM, at least from the data, could be understood as being first emerging with that kind of optimal configuration of the first and second person pronouns and psych verbs in this case. So whenever we're getting direct parameters that are taking off that don't work with other verb types, we know that with psych verbs, for example, it works. Perhaps it's because of there being that clearer conflict, I guess maybe within the grammars of these people, between the syntax and the semantics there. With the other verb types, for example, so with causative, we saw some acceptability with the different full DPs as well, but not enough, I guess, to form a clearer pattern there. But we know with, for example, with small clauses, there is that internal conflict, but then there's also that question of register as well. So perhaps psych verbs are that optimum verb type of there being an internal conflict, to some extent being included in their standard grammar as well, and kind of well distributed within their regional grammar. And also frequency of usage as well. I guess maybe these are the verb types that most lend themselves to having topicalized subjects. You know, I'm worried that, or when it comes to in terms of myself, I'm worried that, I'm convinced that, etc. So perhaps it's a combination of a couple of things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see another question by Puj Mayinko. Aloy?
Yes, hello. Can you? Yes. Hi, ONKAR. Thank you very much. It was a really good presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I've got a question, and perhaps you mentioned it, this kind of second part of the presentation, well, towards the later stage of the presentation, because my internet froze a bit. So apologies if you said that. When you were presenting your results of the acceptability judgment task, we see a kind of an average kind of, not a chance, but around 50-60% of acceptance, right? And you say they seem to accept it. I wonder whether you've thought of intra-group variation and whether you've explored that. I know you've talked about that when you say the younger do something, adults don't, older don't. I wonder whether it's the case that some participants always accept it and some always reject it, and whether that could, because that's something we're seeing in a current project. We're looking at DOM in Catalan, and there are extra factors, extra linguistic factors that modulate that in Catalan. So I wonder whether you've considered that.
Thank you so much. It's a really good point that obviously I overlooked in the presentation, and something definitely worth discovering. I can tell you just in terms of my knowledge of the initial data that I looked at from the questionnaire, that a lot of these where it's kind of at that 50% kind of yes or no point, that it was more accepted with amongst those younger speakers and less accepted amongst those older speakers. Again, it's a bit of a difficult task calling people of around 40 older speakers here, and that's something that needs to be tested a bit more to extend that age group essentially. But it'd be really interesting to kind of extend that age group and also test the data that was there already and see where we're getting that age variation. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely, and I'm saying that because that's exactly what we're seeing in Catalan, where the younger people over accept it, and then there are also other extra linguistic factors that come into the picture, right? Their use of Catalan, their dominance, their attitudes towards Catalan Spanish, all that seem to modulate for whatever reason. So it might be worth considering that and looking at the intra-group variation. Thanks, but excellent presentation. Very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Any more questions for ONKAR? Anna? Anna is frozen now. We cannot hear you, Anna.
Now?
Yes, now we hear you.
Okay, thanks, sorry. So I had a question for a definition question. I think you said more than once that parameters emerged, and yeah, that we have a parameter emerging and so on and so forth. I wondered what exactly you meant by that. When you say a parameter emerges, what do you mean? I'm saying this because, of course, the more parameters there are, the more we have an issue about learnability. We can assume that children can set very, very large parameters. We want the number of parameters that there are to be sort of limited. We think they are maybe lexically limited. Okay, but still, well, that's my question.
Thank you for that, and apologies to everyone if my terminology there hadn't made it clear what I was referring to. So when I'm talking about parameters emerging, I'm talking about structural, in this case it's only structural parameters that hadn't previously been accepted with DOM according to the literature, according to earlier studies and data that are now starting to emerge, or at least from the data from my study, proved to have emerged amongst certain speakers. Again, there's the kind of age and other factors to bear in mind in terms of where that's accepted. So we're talking about, you know, DP types, verb types that have been argued to not have been previously accepted before, but are now more accepted. It's really interesting as well that you mentioned the kind of learnability of it as well, and the fact that amongst children, they'll kind of set larger parameters that are maybe kind of erased once they, you know, once they grow up, for example. And I think, just to quote Belletti, I think it was 2019 or maybe 2018, she has a couple of studies out that look at this, particularly in Florentine Italian. So she tested it with children, I think it was at a daycare center actually, in the Florence area and kind of around Florence, and found that a lot of them accepted parameters that wouldn't be accepted by the adult grammars of these speakers, and accepted them completely outright. So I guess that kind of ties into the whole question about the age group variation as well, and whether we're dealing with something that once these speakers, I don't want to say acquire a better grammar, but acquire a better grammar of the standard, for example, maybe these things are erased out and rubbed out essentially along the way. So at least with those, the group of speakers that were 18, a lot of them hadn't started their university studies yet. So they're in that summer before starting their university studies. So it's not clear at what point of the journey they were at, I guess, in terms of their grammar, and whether this is something that would be deleted along the way. Hope that's answered the question.
Are you talking, Anna?
Lena, porta-me la connection. I'm sorry, I was saying I'm having trouble with the connection, and thanks very much for your answer. Apologies.
No worries.
So any more questions?
Well, I might make a comment as well. If no one else wants to ask anything, it's more a comment rather than anything else. And I'm thinking of a task-based kind of thing of your data, right? Because you're dealing with a dialect, which is a non-standard Italian, I would say, and you're presenting the stimuli, if I got that right, in a written form, right? Do you think that that could potentially also affect your results? What if you were to present them auditorily, or something which is less formal in a way? Because presumably these would not be formal kind of Italian, I would say, right? Don't know whether you've thought about that. And if you're going to do follow-ups, that might be worth considering.
Thank you so much. That's a really good suggestion. I think something definitely I'd like to try moving forward, because like you said, it might give better data.
Yeah, I can't remember who's, I'll try to think of it, and if I find it, I'll send it to you. But someone presented some work on Mallorcan Catalan, on Balear, and they did find asymmetries between acceptability judgment tasks when they presented items auditorily or in a written modality, presumably due to the standard difference. So that might be worth.
Yeah, I think I know the article that you're talking about actually. So yeah, definitely, that's a really good suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I think we can stop here. And thank you again, ONKAR, for this very interesting presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
So we will be seeing next appointment will be on the 1st of October with a presential seminar by Maria Teresa Espinal. And that's it. Have a nice weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
De bon cap de setmana.